Happy Sabbath, church. It's good to be here again. The last time I was here was maybe over a year ago, I think, or maybe almost 2 years ago. I spoke here, and at that time, I was assistant pastor at Jackson Heights Church. And then I went over for a year doing missionary work in Korea, and then I came back. Right now, I'm not officially working for the conference, and but I'm doing my own. I'm still doing the ministry, and we're all required to do the ministry of the Lord, and to do it in whatever way the Lord reveals to us. And so that's why this sermon is really about spreading the gospel. In one way, I feel like I'm doing more of a ministry now than before. I work now in a job in the graphic design industry, and there are a lot of difficult things that a person sees every day. I really see how our culture, many people have really bought into a lot of lies that are being propagated in the big media and in our culture at large. And it makes it very difficult for people to really hear the gospel and to really listen to the gospel. And in America was never perfect. There were always problems in America, but it used to be pretty normal to call yourself a Christian and to say that you accept Christ as your Lord and Savior, and that was a normal thing. And you might look on TV and see programs that were more in accordance with your faith. Now when you turn on the TV, you see all kinds of things. Spiritually, people are very, very relativistic. You know, nobody wants to say, well, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus might be good for you, might not be good for me, and everything is relativistic in a lot of ways. And a lot of people look on Christianity as a myth, and a lot of people look on religion as being a part of the source of the world's problems, and have a hostile view of Christianity in general. And so when I go into work, I constantly am hearing things, either in the background or witnessing personally when I speak to people and interact with people, things that are very, very contrary to what the Bible teaches. And so this talk is about spreading the gospel. So when we look at the passage that was read before in Matthew chapter 14, we turn to that chapter, Matthew chapter 14. And there are different things that go on in that chapter. It starts out with John the Baptist being beheaded. And it was Herod that ended up authorizing this. Herod Antipas, or Herod the Tetrarch. He was the tetrarch, or governor. He was titled king only by Roman courtesy, and he ruled Galilee and Perea after his father Herod the Great had died. He ruled from about 4 BC to 39 AD, after Herod the Great had died. His father was not welcomed, and nor was he. And it was he who was responsible for the murder of John the Baptist, because John spoke the truth against his adulterous relationship with his brother Philip's wife. So John the Baptist was a man of integrity. He was somebody who didn't just believe something, but he lived in accordance with what he believed. And he fit his life together with his beliefs. Oftentimes, we see people who are Christians, and we ourselves may even be guilty of this, of being Christian one day of the week, or maybe for an hour a week. But the rest of our lives are not in accordance, and we are guilty often of not living lives of integrity, because our lives are not consistent with our beliefs. But John the Baptist was somebody whose beliefs got him, and his integrity got him in a lot of trouble. He spoke the truth and ended up in prison, and then eventually ended up being beheaded. He feared. Now Herod Antipas feared the multitudes, and so was afraid. He was afraid to kill John initially because he wanted the respect of the multitudes, and he knew that John the Baptist was respected. And so he didn't want to take him and have him killed, the Bible indicates to us. So he laid hold of him, put him in prison, but Antipas' wife Herodias wanted him dead as well. And at the right time, on Herod's birthday, it happened. Salome, Herodias' daughter, danced for Herod. He gave his word to her that he would give her anything she asked for. And she, instructed by her mother, asked for John's head, and it was so. And so that was the end of John the Baptist. Herod Antipas feared what others thought. And oftentimes we're guilty of this, and I myself am guilty of this. Instead of doing or saying what's right, when the opportunity comes, I'm afraid because of what other people think and what other people have to say. And especially, like I was saying, now in New York, especially with so many people, most unknowingly having bought into the lies that are propagated on the big media. When I say the big media, I mean those very rich media companies and the kinds of things that they put on the TVs and the airwaves, the kinds of ideas. When we look in at a lot of those ideas being propagated, we see relativism. Relativism when it comes to spirituality. There's no right or wrong. There's no truth when it comes to this. Or morality. Anything goes. When it comes to God, keep it to yourself. A lot of times people think of Christianity as a myth. And there's more and more of an open hostility toward Christianity. Just recently, a whole wave of books written by atheists came out. One of the top sellers was the book by Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. And another one was named Harris was another author, and there was Hitchkins and a bunch of others. I read The God Delusion. I wanted to see what he had to say. And I found out that it was a very strange thing. Most of the attacks on religion, most of the ammunition was gathered from Islam, really. A lot of the bad things that Islam had done were used as the source of the attack, but the attack was mostly aimed at Christianity. He didn't seem to have much of a problem with Buddhism or Hinduism or these other religions, and even made excuses why those were not really the concern. But Christianity was attacked heavily, and Judaism, and a lot of the ammunition was gathered from Islam. And so we live in a culture that's very hostile to our views, and our views as Christians have become more and more marginalized. Like I said, in the past, maybe 50 years ago, it was normal to state your beliefs as a Christian, but not now. And it's not even because people are really studying into why Christianity should be a problem. It's just because they're just buying into the popular culture, buying into those ideas. Herod Antipas feared what others thought. He feared what those who respected, he feared the thoughts of those who respected and revered John. And at his birthday party, he also feared what his prestigious guests thought of him. Because when Salome had danced for him, he had a lot of prestigious guests there. He had a lot of important people at his birthday party, and he made an oath in front of them all. He said, I'll give you anything you want. In another gospel, it says, up to the half of my kingdom. But still, virtually the same thing. And when he made that oath, he wasn't expecting what came out of it. He wasn't planning ahead. He didn't plan ahead. He didn't assess the situation. He made a thoughtless oath and probably didn't realize what would come out of it. So he was a man ruled over by fear rather than by faith, and by selfishness and pride. And sorry to say, many of us see a lot of that in ourselves. I myself struggle with those things. I guess we all do because of our sinful nature that we were born into and the struggle that comes out of that. We really have to go against ourselves to do God's will. Proverbs 4. We're going to be turning to a lot of passages in this talk. Proverbs 4. If you look to Proverbs 4, there's some of my favorite passages there. Verses 25 to 27. Proverbs 4, 25 to 27. This is a good tip, I think, in general for us. In Proverbs 4, 25 to 27, it says, "Let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Make level paths for your feet, and take only ways that are firm. And do not swerve to the right or to the left, but keep your foot from evil." I think there's a very powerful lesson, especially for us, when it comes to witnessing and in our experience as Christians. Really, as Christians, we should be focused on our purpose. And God has a purpose for each one of us. God wants each one of us ultimately to share in his love, but here on earth, he wants us to be part of that evidence of his goodness. He wants us to witness for him. Now, some people don't want to witness. They don't want to speak because they say, that's not my talent. Well, it's not my talent either. We have different talents, and you might read about them in Romans chapter 12 or other places. Regardless of what your talent is, God calls each one of us to spread the gospel and to be an ambassador for Christ. And he wouldn't call us to do that if he wouldn't be with us, and if he wouldn't guide us, and if it weren't possible. As Paul says in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Jesus Christ who strengthens me. And Paul even admitted that in person he wasn't a great speaker, he was a good writer. His letters were strong, but his speaking might have not been so strong. A lot of people had the idea that Paul was a very powerful speaker, but he admits it's not so. But at the same time, God calls each one of us to witness on behalf of him. And when we're in situations that are difficult or scary, I think it's a good tip to keep this proverb in mind. It says that we should really look straight ahead. Keep your eyes on your focus. The main focus of our lives should be God and his will. His will for everyone is to come to him. This is accomplished through Christ, as the gospel tells us. When it comes to witnessing and spreading the gospel, we should assess our situations in life and in the present moment and stay focused. You're in a situation that might be difficult, maybe at work, or maybe you come into a situation where you hear people speaking about something, and you have an opportunity in that situation to say something about Christ, to spread the gospel, but you're afraid. First thing, assess the situation. Let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Keep your focus. Make level paths for your feet, and take ways that are right and firm. Understand the situation at hand. Take ways that are right and firm. Know the best way to handle it. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Keep your foot from evil. So maybe you might be in a situation, in a workplace, or in another instance. You see an opportunity, but you're afraid to something. You're afraid to say something. When we are faced with opportunities to spread the gospel, we often fear the opinions and thoughts of others. Like Herod, we fear what they will think of us. And oftentimes, we fear our pride being hurt. That's one of the things that we fear, our pride getting hurt. I don't want them to say something and put me down. And we put the focus on ourselves. Herod may have had many fears concerning the opinions and thoughts of, or the intents of others, and so might we. But we should only reverence or fear God. God is really the only one that should be the focus of our reverence and our fear. Now, again, in the time we live in, some people say, I have a problem when you say to fear God, because they feel that if you fear God, you can't love him, that the two don't work together. But biblically speaking, when you look at it throughout the Bible, you see that the two really do work together. Really, God is the only one in control. No one else has power over our eternal destiny or over our lives. Nobody else. So if we fear someone else other than God, that's really an act of faith. And the faith is being directed toward the thing that we fear. So you're putting your fear into another person. You're putting your fear into the opinions of others or into something other than God. And in that way, you're giving those things power over you. But God is the only one that we should fear. And then from that, the fear of God, comes wisdom. It means that you're putting God above all else. You're putting God above everything. You're allowing God to be the cause of your actions rather than your fears of other people. You're allowing God to control you. You're answering to God. When you do not do something because you're afraid to do it because of what other people think, you're answering to that person. You're answering to someone other than God. Let's look in Matthew 10, verse 28. Jesus says here in Matthew 10, verse 28, he says, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Who is that one? That's God. God is the only one with the power over your eternal destiny. We know that Paul had a difficult life after he became a Christian, but he always had peace inside. If you're at peace with the world, there's no peace inside. But when you have peace inside, you may not have peace with the world. Look at the difference in Paul's life. Before he was a Christian, he had respect from the Sanhedrin. He had respect from the people around him, and he really didn't have to worry. He was terrorizing the Christian community, but that really didn't cause him any physical harm. So outside, he had peace, but inside, he didn't. But then when he became a Christian, now he had peace. God had revealed himself to him. Christ had come to him, changed his whole way of thinking, but now he didn't have peace outside. He had been stoned at one point. He'd been beaten and thrown into jail at another point. He was in a shipwreck, and on and on. But he knew that he was with God. Let's turn to Mark chapter 3. I like Mark because Mark is one of the most forceful gospels. We really have Jesus presented in such a strong way. You know, Jesus says the least in the Gospel of Mark than any other gospel. But it's such a strong gospel. It really allows us to see that Jesus wasn't somebody who was controlled by what other people thought. Look at chapter 3 of Mark, 21. Let's look at chapter 3, verse 21. It says here, when his family heard about this, now that's Jesus' family. Well, let me go back to 20. Mark chapter 3, verse 20, I'll start there. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he is out of his mind. His own family thought he was out of his mind. Jesus' own family. And then in verse 31, in the same chapter, then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you." And Jesus said, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him, and he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." So Jesus was really doing something that his immediate family weren't favorable of. They didn't like it. When you tell the truth about Jesus, you are going to offend people. The truth offends people. Jesus offended lots of people. John the Baptist offended people because the world is afflicted by sin, and the natural flow of sin is toward death. And so as a Christian, you're going opposite that flow. You're going opposite the flow in the world, and you're going opposite the flow in your life. It's not comfortable, but you can't wait till it becomes comfortable to spread the gospel. You have to make the choice, despite your comfort level. And little by little, your feelings will start to go in the right direction. Your feelings will follow, but you don't do things because of your feelings. You do things because they're right. At least that's what the Bible is indicating to us. So Herod was really somebody who was mastered by his feelings, but John the Baptist and Jesus were people who are mastered by the will of God. And we see the very different types of lives they lead. Now in Matthew 14, Jesus sends his disciples across the Sea of Galilee. The water is rough and the winds are strong. So we're back in Matthew 14 again, where the text that was read was taken from, the main text of the sermon. Matthew 14. And we're seeing here that the disciples were in a situation that caused them a lot of grief. Starting at verse 22, Matthew 14:22. Okay, so Jesus sends his disciples ahead of himself into this storm, really. It is a storm just like the times of the disciples were stormy socially and politically. The times that the disciples lived in were stormy times for the Jewish nation. Socially, they were stormy times. Politically, they had rulers that they didn't want. Things were going on that they weren't happy about. There's a lot of parallels between those times and our times. So we live in stormy times as well. Stormy times socially, stormy times politically. And our lives are full of storms. But in the midst of the storms, Jesus walks on the water. Verse 25. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried here. Oh. I don't think there's a storm outside. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Be not afraid." Jesus told them, "Be not afraid. Take courage, it is I." He gives a command. In the midst of that storm, Jesus gives a command. It's like the command, it's like the agape love. We read about the love that the Bible speaks about, for example, in 1 Corinthians 13. It speaks of a love, agape. Now, many people are familiar with the four different kinds of loves in the Greek language of that time. There was eros, which was the passionate, romantic sort of love. And then there was storge, which was a family love, and there was phileo, which is more of a friendship. But the agape love is special in a way because it's not a love that is really, it's really not a feeling so much as it is principles and actions. When we read about the agape love in chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, it's a love that doesn't depend so much on your feelings, but it's a love that depends on actions and principles. You might illustrate that love for an enemy, not because you feel a nice feeling toward that person, but because you treat that person the right way. When Jesus was giving this command here, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. He wasn't so much giving a command for us to he didn't expect the disciples all of a sudden to feel courage in the boat. You know, when they were in that storm. He didn't expect them to just have a powerful and courageous feeling, but he was actually giving a call to action. The feelings may come later on, but now the actions must come first. And Jesus is commanding the disciples to act in a certain way. He commands them to be of good cheer and be not afraid. But this does not magically change feelings. The command that Jesus gives to have courage and to be of good cheer is not going to magically change the feelings of the disciples. It is a call to brave actions done in faith. And a truly brave action oftentimes requires you going against even your feelings. There's a biblical bravery that's very different from a worldly bravery, which isn't a true bravery. Oftentimes in the world, we see people that are very loud, and people who are it seems that they're very fearless to express their opinions. And it seems that they have a lot of courage. But when you take a closer consideration of the situation, you find that it's not really that they have true courage, it's that they feel that they have an advantage. Sometimes you'll see a big man who's got a very big mouth, and he talks and he scares everyone. But if he comes into contact with someone bigger than him, or someone stronger than him, you'll notice he doesn't act the same way. And a lot of people display a kind of a courage where it seems they have no fear in saying what they feel. They don't have any fear to insult Christianity. They don't have any fear to put you down for your beliefs. But it's because they understand that they have the culture at large on their side. They understand that the things on TV are saying this is how it should be. And these Christians are outcasts, really. They know they have an advantage. And that's the kind of courage that the Bible is not talking about. The kind of courage that the Bible is talking about is sometimes you may realize that you don't have the advantage in a worldly sense. You don't have the physical advantage over your opponents, or people with your opinion might not be so numerous, or your opinion might not be so popular. But you know God is with you. And so you express your opinion and you carry yourself in faith, even though it may be against the culture at large or even against your own feelings. That's true courage. That's the kind of courage that Jesus had. He was outnumbered in a physical sense. There were way more people who were against him. And the Sanhedrin were against him, and a lot of the rabbis were against him, and a lot of other people were against him. And people wanted to stone him, people wanted to get him, and he didn't exert any physical advantage over those around him, yet he carried himself based on the principles that come from God. And he exhibited true courage. And so when Jesus is calling his disciples to brave actions done in faith, we see it illustrated in part, not perfectly, but in part by Peter. Peter assessed the situation, going back to that passage in Proverbs and what I was saying about it. Peter assessed the situation. He was well aware of the storm and the dangers. He even wanted to make sure Jesus was really there. So he understood the situation he was in. Intending to follow Jesus, he focused on Jesus and he physically got up, following the command Jesus had given him. Peter said, well, Jesus, if that's really you over there, call me to come to you. And Jesus said, come. And so Peter followed the command. He followed the command against the apparent danger of the situation. He knew it was a storm. He knew that it was water between him and Jesus. He understood the situation, but he followed the command nonetheless. Intending to walk to Jesus, he focused on Jesus, and he physically got up. He followed the command Jesus gave him, and he took action. That's courage. You listen to God, and you follow him despite your fear of the situation. You keep your focus on God. You understand the situation you're in, but you look through that situation, and you look to God. So before, when I was reading that passage in Proverbs about keeping your head straight, looking straight ahead of you, taking paths that are firm and straight, let not your foot go to the left or your right. It's the same thing. Keep your focus on God. Peter kept his focus on God and walked through the difficulty of that situation. He understood the situation, he assessed it, but he looked through it at God. And this is what we have to do, especially in our daily lives when we have witnessing opportunities and we fear to spread the gospel. We fear to say something. Assess the situation. Understand, who do I fear, God or man? Who should I focus on? I should focus on God. He focused on Jesus. He physically got up. He took action. But then he stopped midway in. He stopped in that action he had planned, and instead of focusing on Jesus, he focused on the storm. Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, and he started to look at the storm. And then he began to sink. But he did not, even in that point, he didn't lose sight of Jesus, and he prayed to Jesus, and Jesus saved him. But we see that when Peter kept his focus on Christ, and he followed the command, he was able to prevail. There's someone on our side more powerful than on the side of those around us who oppose God. There's somebody with us greater than in the world. There may be many, many people who oppose us in a given situation, but with God on our side, we can overcome. 1 John 4:18. 1 John 4:18. 1 John 4:18. In 1 John 4:18 it says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love." And again, that love being mentioned there is the agape love, a love that consists in principles, not just in feelings. You might not feel like spreading the gospel. You might not feel like saying something at a certain time, or doing the right thing might not feel right. But when you focus on Christ, you don't focus on those negative things. You focus on Christ, and you take action despite your feelings. The agape love, the perfect love, is a love that is a love based on principles and actions. Not always necessarily your feelings. Your feelings will follow. God is love. In the same chapter, verse 8, God is love. And again, the word is agape. There is a PhD scholar named Michael Licona, and he says that there are actually eyewitness accounts of the scourging victims in the ancient world. Now, the scourging, of course, is the beating with the whip that Jesus endured. And that whip had oftentimes a metal at the end. And the metal would tear pieces of flesh out of whoever was whipped. And there are actually eyewitness accounts of scourging victims in the ancient world that reported victims being so severely whipped that their intestines and veins were laid bare. Tacitus was a second century figure, and also we have many writings of Tacitus from that time, and he referred to crucifixion as the extreme penalty. Cicero called it cruel and disgusting. These were the penalties that Christ suffered for us in order to save us. He wore a crown of thorns on earth, but in heaven wears a crown of glory. Our God of love laid himself bare for us on the cross and suffered and died to save us. There is nothing to fear that it can compare to what Jesus faced when he faced eternal separation from the Father on the cross. And there is nothing that can separate us from his love. And so many of the things that we fear when it comes to spreading the gospel, when it comes to sharing our faith with others, those things are really nothing. And when we assess those things that we fear, when we make note of them, even when we spell it out in our mind, what do I fear in this situation? I fear maybe somebody yelling at me. I fear maybe somebody thinking badly of me or not looking at me the same anymore. Or maybe I won't be so popular anymore. When we start to look at those things for what they are, we realize they're really nothing compared to what God has for us. Witnessing is difficult and often requires us to ask ourselves, who do we fear, God or man? And whom do we trust? And who do we give the power over our lives? Now, we live in a place, we live in a time where we have a lot of people who don't have the Bible as the basis for their worldview or their thinking anymore. And we have to consider where they're coming from when we speak to them. And so the Bible gives us some clues, actually, on how to speak to people and how to spread the gospel. And I just want to look at a few of those before I close. In Ephesians 4:15, we see one. It's very few words, but it gives a very strong and good message. It basically is telling us that we should speak the truth in love. Sometimes when we are witnessing, we want to force the truth on the person, or sometimes we're not considering who we're speaking to and we just want to win. Or once we get on a roll, we're no longer sensitive to the situation, to the person we're talking to. We have to be sensitive to that person. And we have to speak the truth in love. Let's look also at 1 Peter 3:15. 1 Peter 3:15. In 1 Peter 3:15 it says, "But in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." So here is a few clues on how to speak: with love, with gentleness, and respect. Love, gentleness, and respect. Sometimes when we're witnessing, we won't always bring a person to the foot of the cross. Sometimes we won't always hit a home run. When you're speaking to someone, sometimes you go further when you ask questions than make statements. Sometimes we feel as a Christian, if I want to spread the gospel, that means that I have to explain the whole gospel to the person. And when we do that, we usually don't get very far. Or sometimes we put so much on ourselves that we don't do anything. Or we say, well, what if this person knows more than I do? Or what if this person outsmarts me? And because we start thinking in that way, we don't do anything. Sometimes you go further when you just ask a question. And there are two big questions that you can ask. If somebody makes a very controversial statement, you might simply ask them, what do you mean by that? Or how do you come to that conclusion? Proverbs 18:17 has a very interesting thing to say. Proverbs 18:17. If I can find it. Proverbs 18:17. It says here, the first to present his case seems right, till another comes forward and questions him. Sometimes we hear a person make a case or somebody say something very controversial. It says that that person might seem right until another person comes forward and questions him. Sometimes if you hear somebody, for example, I work with people who have who vary in their views, especially when it comes to religion and other things. And I might ask, what do you mean by that? Or why do you say that? Or where do you come to that conclusion? Sometimes you go further when you ask the right questions rather than making statements. And always listen to the person when they speak to you. Sometimes you might build a relationship with a person. You don't always have to hit a home run. Don't put that pressure on yourself. And just concentrate on getting up at bat. Don't concentrate on hitting a home run. And you might find that when you take these small steps in spreading your faith, it may become more part of you to do it, rather than staying silent. If someone yells at you or speaks to you in an angry way or even may curse at you when you try to share your faith, you can say to them, "You don't have to yell at me. Come, let us reason together. I'll listen to you, and when it's my turn to speak, you listen to me." I've had experiences like that where I've had somebody start yelling, and I said, "You don't have to yell. I'll listen to you." And then it had a calming effect. In Isaiah 1:18, God says, "Come, let us reason together." When we look at Proverbs chapter 17, we don't have to turn there now because I realize that I'm making you turn all over the place. But just you can look at it later on, Proverbs 17. In Proverbs 17, 14, 19, 27, and 28, there is some very interesting advice there. Proverbs 17, 14, 19, 27, and 28. It says that he who loves to quarrel loves sin. He who loves to quarrel loves sin. And it also says that a man of knowledge exercises his words with restraint. And even a fool who holds his tongue can be counted as wise. So sometimes you do have to be silent. At other times, you have to speak. But exercise your words with restraint, speak the truth in love, gentleness, and respect. And you'll find that you will go further than if you just went out and desired to bring the person to the foot of the cross. Sometimes when we concentrate on whether the person accepts what we say, we end up doing nothing because we are afraid, well, they won't accept what I'm saying. They won't believe what I'm saying. It's the Holy Spirit's job to convert the heart. We can't make a person believe what we believe, but we are required to be a witness. And sometimes you're witnessing just by simply asking a question or making a statement and letting the person speak and even giving them the last word. Sometimes we want to have the last word, or we want to win, and that ends up hurting us and hurting the conversation. And sometimes you do have to let the person go. Even Jesus says, "Don't throw pearls to swine." So at some point you may realize that this person, maybe it's not the best thing to go any further, because when you throw pearls to swine, what happens? They trample them under feet, and then they turn and tear you to pieces. That's basically what the Bible is telling us. So I think it does us good to pay attention to the advice that the Bible gives us, because it doesn't give us the instructions to put on ourselves the pressure to make that person believe what we believe. It does give us the instruction to speak the truth in love. And sometimes it's just making a statement or making a comment or building a relationship. Sometimes you go further by asking questions. And sometimes you have to let the person get the last word. But when you do these things little by little, it becomes part of you. And when you look through the difficulty of your situation and you concentrate on Christ and you concentrate on God, you keep your focus and you go further. We are called to speak the gospel effectively, and sometimes that may involve not getting to the heart of the gospel, but making a push toward it, unless the situation demonstrates that silence is justified. There were times when Jesus didn't speak, or when he was asked a question, he didn't answer it directly. But those things should be done not based on our comfort level, but based on whether it's proper or right. Like throwing pearls to swine, we are also called to make contact. Let me not read that out of context. Unless the situation demonstrates that silence is justified, like throwing pearls to swine. There are times when silence is the better path. We are called to make contact and break barriers. In doing so, we may think tactically. When the tactics go out, sometimes you don't go any further. The Bible gives us those tactics, and I mentioned a couple of them. Don't try to hit a home run. Just try to get up at bat. And if you hit someone with your best shot and they don't even blink, don't go any further. Now, what I mean by that is sometimes you make something very clear. Sometimes a person has a question or makes a statement, and you respond in a very clear way, and they still don't get it. Sometimes you got to let those things go. Otherwise, you're just going to end up getting frustrated. Let the person get the last word. Don't always try and win the argument. Self-control may involve you considering how you speak and when not to speak, rather than trying to win. The Bible reveals to us that God's word will not return to him void. And as long as you're there to be willing to spread that word, there will be an effect. And it will do something. You might not know when you speak to someone, you might think they don't listen. You might think they don't hear what you're saying. But you don't know what effect that word is having on them. And every Christian who might along the way run into that person might build upon that foundation that draws that person to Christ. Don't concentrate so much on the results. Just be willing to be used by God, and he can do amazing things for you and through you. Sometimes we look at a preacher who baptizes 50 or something people, and we think, well, I don't have any stars in my crown. But you don't realize that preacher might come along and just pick the fruit. But you don't realize who was there who watered the tree, who was there to make sure the tree grew correctly, who was there to nourish the tree. Every one of you may play a role in the bringing in of the sheaves. Every one of you might play an important role in the conversion of a soul, and you might not even know it. So when you get to heaven, you might have 50 or more stars in your crown, and you don't even realize it. Because that preacher who might baptize 50 souls or something, he might be doing the end part of the job. But we don't know how many other people were involved in that process along the way. So don't always concentrate on the results. Don't always concentrate on, well, this person's not listening, or, well, it's not going the way I want it. Don't concentrate. Just be willing for God to use you. As long as you're willing to be used, you've already met your purpose. Your purpose isn't converting the person and bringing him to baptism and getting him to accept the gospel fully. Your purpose is to allow God to use you. Let God move you and use you. And if you forget all else, keep your focus on God and take a step in faith.